AP Biology, Chapter 45, the Endocrine System, Part 2. Where we left off, we learned that the anterior pituitary has a lot more hormones than the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary only releases two hormones. If you remember, there is only ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. ADH stimulates you to conserve water. Oxytocin releases milk from mammary glands. Oxytocin will also be involved with the push from women of the uterine muscles during pregnancy. And then we have the anterior pituitary that has FSH and LH, which are two hormones that will stimulate the testes and ovaries to produce things like estrogen and testosterone. We have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that stimulates the thyroid. ACTH will stimulate the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline. Prolactin will stimulate the mammary glands to produce milk. MSH produces something called melanocytes that we're not going to test you on. Endorphins are pain-reducing chemicals in the brain that results in less pain. Runners make a lot of endorphins from their anterior pituitary when they run a long time, and that's sometimes called a runner's high. Then we have the growth hormones that are going to be involved with just stimulating growth during development. So the first set of hormones that we're going to be learning about affects the thyroid, and you should understand how these things are connected. The hypothalamus is your master control center. Remember that. Anterior pituitary, master gland, that releases a ton of hormones, and the thyroid. So the hypothalamus will release something called TRH, or TSH releasing hormone. This goes from hypothalamus to anterior pituitary and triggers the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, in response to TRH, produces something called TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone, as you might guess, stimulates the thyroid. If you ever get these two hormones confused, just remember, thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates thyroid, so it's going to the thyroid from the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus will never come after the anterior pituitary. It's always hypothalamus, then pituitary, and then thyroid. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary. All right, so then the anterior pituitary releases something called TSH into the bloodstream, thyroid stimulating hormone, that's an endocrine function, and targets the thyroid. The thyroid produces two hormones called T3 and T4, and these hormones are involved with a lot. They're involved with bone growth, mental development, metabolism. If you have poor metabolism, it might be the result of not making enough T3 and T4. Or if you don't make TSH, you won't make T3 or T4, and you also might have a slow metabolism. It's also involved with blood pressure and heart rate, muscle tone, digestion, reproduction. Especially understand that it's involved with metabolism and how fast you break down things or how slow you break down things. And if it doesn't work right, if you don't make enough of these hormones, then you might have a slow metabolism. If you overmake some of these hormones, you might have a fast metabolism. Here we have a little diagram showing how this works. Hypothalamus makes TRH, stimulates anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases TSH, targets the thyroid. The thyroid makes T3 and T4, which has all these actions. T3 and T4 will bind to receptors in the brain, in the anterior pituitary, to stop making more TSH. So once you make all of that growth hormones or rather T3 and T4 hormones that you need, the production of those hormones is negative feedback to shut it down. Go ahead and review thyroid regulation of metabolism and the role of the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and thyroid. So what happens if you have a disease of the thyroid? Well, hyperthyroidism is called Graves' disease. Hypothyroidism gives you something called cretinism, or underactive thyroid, cretinism, overactive thyroid, Graves' disease. If you have Graves' disease, hyperthyroidism, you'll feel overactive and anxious all the time. If you have hypothyroidism, then you'll feel tired all the time, or maybe you'll have a slower metabolism and gain some weight for that. If you don't have iodine in your diet, that's a cofactor, a type of mineral. If the iodine's not in your diet, you can't make T3 and T4 hormones, and you'll have hypothyroidism. You also form something called a goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid. So now let's talk a little bit about thyroid and how it maintains calcium levels in your blood. So let's say that you drink some milk. You now get some calcium in your blood, and what are you going to do about it? Well, After the calcium gets absorbed by your small intestine, it enters your bloodstream, and then your calcium levels go up in your blood. As a response to rising calcium levels, your thyroid gland releases a hormone called calcitonin. Now, this one's not too hard to remember. Calcitonin, calcium, that's the calcium that's in something like milk. So the thyroid's going to release calcitonin. This is a different hormone other than T3 and T4 that are involved with metabolism. The calcitonin targets the kidney as well as the bones. And as you can imagine, we're going to want to remove that calcium from the blood and store it. And we're going to store it in the bones as a result of calcitonin. Calcitonin also results in reduced calcium uptake by the kidneys. So that means you pee out the extra calcium. And then the calcium levels drop in your blood. And then you have homeostasis of the calcium levels in your body. Remember, this is negative feedback. We have rising calcium levels as a result of drinking things like milk or getting calcium in our diet somehow, and then the calcitonin lowers the calcium levels. Now, sitting on top of your thyroid gland are some things called parathyroid glands, and these parathyroids are going to be involved with the other hormone involved with calcium homeostasis. Let's say you have low calcium levels in your blood. Now, if you don't know this, calcium is involved with muscle contraction, as we're going to learn about in a future class. So you need calcium in order to contract muscles. If calcium levels fall in the blood, well, we have it stored in the bones, so we need to release some of that calcium from our bones. As a result of falling calcium levels, the parathyroid gland sitting on top of your thyroid will release something called parathyroid hormone, or PTH. PTH, also called parathyroid hormone, will be released from the parathyroid glands and target the bones. And then the bones release calcium, calcium enters your bloodstream, and calcium levels rise. PTH, or parathyroid hormone, also does one more thing. It stimulates the calcium to be uptaken in greater quantities in the kidney, and then the calcium can be reabsorbed from the small intestines as well in response to vitamin D, also released by the kidneys. So let's review. Calcium levels go up. The thyroid gland releases calcitonin. Calcitonin targets the bones and kidneys to take up the calcium from the blood, lowers our calcium levels, homeostasis of calcium achieved. Let's say our calcium levels go down. As the calcium levels go down, the parathyroid glands that sits on top of your thyroid glands releases PTH that targets the bones and kidneys. The bones will release calcium into the bloodstream. The kidneys will be stimulated to reabsorb more calcium into the bloodstream, and then our calcium levels rise. Homeostasis of calcium levels achieved. Both are examples of negative feedback. Make sure that you know the difference between the two. I always think of calcitonin before I think of parathyroid hormone. So if you can make a sentence out of it, calcitonin will reduce calcium in the blood. If you remember that sentence, remember that the thyroid will be producing calcitonin. They lower the calcium levels in the blood, and that's really the job of calcitonin. Remember that PTH works the opposite of calcitonin. So if you know what calcitonin does, you automatically know what PTH does as well. It works antagonistically, or opposite in its effect of the other hormone involved with calcium. Here we have one that we've learned before in the past. We have the two hormones produced by the pancreas, insulin and glucagon, involved with sugar homeostasis. Let's say we have rising sugar levels as a result of eating a bag of peanut M&Ms. Now we have high blood sugar, hyperglycemia. Insulin is going to be released from your pancreas. Remember, that's an endocrine gland when it's releasing the insulin right into the bloodstream. The insulin targets the liver to take up the extra glucose and store it as glycogen, which is animal starch. Save it for a rainy day. Also, your body cells are also triggered to take up that glucose by the insulin. And as the sugar enters your cells to do cell respiration and enters the liver to be stored as animal starch, then the blood sugar levels decrease and homeostasis achieved. Now, the one that you might not know so much about is the opposite of insulin, or glucagon. Works antagonistically. You don't have to know about the alpha cells and beta cells here. The sugar levels might drop. Let's say you're exercising and you or skipped a meal. As a result, the insulin is not going to be released from the pancreas. That would be useless. You would further lower your blood sugar levels. A different hormone called glucagon is released from the pancreas. The glucagon also targets the liver, and the liver will break down that glycogen, turn it back into sugars. It's really just a chain of sugars, release into the bloodstream, and then blood glucose levels go up again, homeostasis of sugar levels achieved. So again, if you know what insulin does, which lowers blood sugars, you automatically know what glucagon does, which raises blood sugars. And you can kind of remember glucagon, glucose, it's going to be involved with making glucose from glycogen stored in the liver. All right, go ahead and review the role of insulin and glucagon as two hormones involved with sugar homeostasis. All right, the stress response. So let's say you see a bear. Well, you know what happens when you're in a situation like this. Your heart beats faster, your breathing speeds up, maybe your mouth feels dry. A lot of things happen. Let's talk about why. In the fast response to stress, we use the nervous system. Remember, the nervous system is much faster than the endocrine system, and both are going to be involved with stress response. On the left-hand side, we have the fast response, nervous system mainly, and then on the right-hand side, we have the slower response using just the hormones. All right, so here we have the signal from the brain, from the hypothalamus, after receiving the information from the sensory neurons, like in the eyeball and other places, to detect the bear coming. We're going to send a quick response right down our spinal cord, all the way to the adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys. And in the center of the adrenal glands is a place called the adrenal medulla. The medulla is usually referring to the center or the internal parts of a structure. In the middle of your adrenal glands, the adrenal medulla, you're going to release two things, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, you might have heard of epinephrine before. It's also called adrenaline. And adrenaline is going to have a variety of effects. The first effect is that it's going to stimulate the release of glycogen broken down into glucose to increase blood glucose. Now, think about why that's a survival advantage. You've seen a bear. A bear is about to attack you, maybe even eat you. In a wild situation, this might be a life or death situation. So why would having more blood glucose be good if you're about to fight off a predator? Well, the answer is you're going to be using up a lot of energy to fight off that predator, and to increase your blood glucose levels ahead of time allows you the extra glucose that you're going to need in order to do more cell respiration, so you have more energy to fight off that attacker. You're also going to increase blood pressure and increase breathing rate. You're going to be getting rid of carbon dioxide faster as a result of exercise, fighting off bears, and you're going to get oxygen into your body faster as well. Increased metabolic rate. You're going to start speeding up in general as a result of this fight or flight response. Interestingly, you're going to have some changes to blood flow, and you're actually going to have decreased digestion and kidney activity. If you're fighting off bears, digesting your food is the least of your problems, so those things kind of get put on hold until you are in a more relaxed state. So in the fast response, the nervous system sends a signal down to the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, basically very similar, and we're going to have more sugar in our blood from the breakdown of glycogen stored in your liver, increased blood pressure, increased breathing rate, and increased metabolism, but decreased digestion. All right, so what are the long-term responses? Well, the hypothalamus will send another signal down to the anterior pituitary and release something called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. This hormone will release two hormones from the outer part of the adrenal glands called the adrenal cortex. So ACTH stimulates the adrenal glands to produce two things, mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. Mineral corticoids will increase blood volume and blood pressure in response to an attack, also will retain more water by the kidneys. Glucocorticoids will allow protein and fats to be broken down faster into glucose to provide more glucose into your bloodstream. Also, the immune system might be suppressed. So people that are in stress situations over and over again sometimes have compromised immune systems and become sick more often as a result of being flooded with glucocorticoids. All right, so let's go and review the long-term response to stress. First step, anterior pituitary releases ACTH to help you remember that, adrenal cortex, AC. And then it releases two things from the adrenal glands, mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids, which are both involved with getting you ready for a fight. And the big one you should know is that glucocorticoids release glucose into your bloodstream as a response to needing that glucose in a possible danger situation. All right, so let's review some of this stuff. Hypothalamus, once again, is the master control gland. This is the interchange between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is directly connected to the pituitary gland. Now, there's two parts of the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is also called the master gland, and you should know that as well. Pituitary gland, master gland, hypothalamus, master control center. The pituitary gland has two parts. It has the posterior pituitary, posterior toward the back. Anterior pituitary is toward the front. Now, the posterior pituitary really only has two hormones. The two hormones are ADH, antidiuretic hormone for conserving more water, which targets your kidneys, and you should know that. And the second hormone is called oxytocin. Oxytocin allows the release of milk from the mammary glands when children suckle. Also, oxytocin will be involved with pushing out the kid when we have muscle contraction, smooth muscle contraction during childbirth. The anterior pituitary releases a lot of different hormones, and they target a lot of different endocrine glands. So if you remember, way back here, we have the here we go, adrenal gland. Adrenal gland releases FSH and LH. We'll talk more about that with the reproductive system, targets the testes and ovaries. TSH, we talked about that just recently. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, which targets the thyroid to make T3 and T4. You need iodine to make these two hormones, and that's going to be involved with metabolism. We have ACTH released by the anterior pituitary that targets the adrenal cortex, which is the adrenal glands, to release more sugar into the bloodstream. Prolactin released by the anterior pituitary, think lactating, that's milk. Pro means before milk, that's going to target the mammary glands to make milk for the child. So you can imagine that's probably only produced during pregnancy. MSH, don't worry about. Endorphins, they're just pain chemicals or pain-reducing chemicals produced by the brain. That's the only thing you have to know about endorphins. And growth hormones. Growth hormones, as name imply, allows and controls growth. So if you have a problem with your pituitary gland, then you might not grow as high or for as long. So a lot of things going on with that anterior pituitary, located right here. All right, so next one was the thyroid gland. If you remember, that produces T3 and T4 hormones for metabolism. If you have a overactive thyroid, that means you might be more active and anxious. If you have an underactive thyroid, that might mean you're slowing down a little bit. And if you don't have any iodine, then the thyroid can't make T3 and T4 and becomes enlarged and gives you a condition called a goiter. Now, the thyroid is also involved with calcium levels. Thyroid produces something called calcitonin. When you have high calcium levels in your blood, calcitonin is released by the thyroid. That lowers calcium levels, and that's going to target places like your bones as well as your kidneys. The parathyroid glands are only involved with calcium levels, and they work antagonistically to the thyroid glands. When you have lowering calcium levels in your blood, the parathyroid glands will release PTH, parathyroid hormone, that targets the bones to release calcium to raise calcium levels in your blood. The thymus, located here, is only involved with the maturation of T cells, and that was part of chapter 43. You remember that all your white blood cells start in your bone marrow. If it's a B cell, it matures in the bone marrow. However, if it's a T cell involved with the third line of defense, it matures in the thymus. And that's why it's called a T cell. T stands for thymus. The adrenal glands release things like adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And that's going to increase your heart rate, increase your breathing rate, and release glycogen from your liver in order to produce more glucose in your bloodstream. The adrenal glands also produce mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. That's in response to ACTH released by the pituitary gland, and that's also going to increase sugar levels in your body. Your pancreas has endocrine and exocrine function. You should know that. The exocrine function, ducted glands, is to secrete via duct things like enzymes right into your small intestine. The endocrine function of the pancreas involves sugar homeostasis, insulin and glucagon. Insulin lowers blood sugar glucose levels by targeting the liver to take up more sugars, and glucagon raises blood sugar levels by targeting the liver to release some of that glycogen as glucose. Then we have two hormones produced by the pituitary, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone as well as luteinizing hormone, that target the ovaries and testes, that cause them to release things like estrogen and testosterone that we'll talk about with reproduction. All right, so go ahead and review these glands, what they produce, and what's their target and effects. This ends your notes on Chapter 45, the endocrine system.